Welcome to episode 9 of the Various and Sundry podcast. I am your host, Matt Harmon, joined in studio, as always, by my good friend, my go-to guy for Mets baseball, women's soccer, and the coronavirus, John Sloat.
Matt, how's it going?
It's going well. It's going well. Welcome to Super Tuesday.
We're recording Tuesday.
On Tuesday morning of Super Tuesday. So, not that we're a political podcast, but it's...
And not that where we live votes on Super Tuesday
Correct.
Either, but
yeah,
lots of states do.
We're very much in a non-voting state here when it comes to Super Tuesday. I don't even know when the Indiana primary is. It's like in May, isn't
It's
it?
usually so late, it just
meaning
isn't of any
irrelevant
consequence.
in terms of the nomination. So in any case, we appreciate you tuning in to the Various and Sundry podcast. You can always check in with us on Twitter at V&S Pod, and we appreciate we had a listener ask us a question on Twitter this past week that we
a little sarcastic question.
Well, hey, we kind of deal in sarcasm and snark a little bit around here, so it's
I'd say so.
It's part of our idiom. Also, you can email the podcast variousandSundrypodcast@gmail.com. And so as we start, we need to do our coronavirus update. I will point out, we have been on the cutting edge of this story.
We were talking about coronavirus before the national news media
Way before the national news media got in front of this. We were your go-to source for coronavirus updates. And so, John, fill us in on where we stand today.
Yeah, coronavirus is spreading throughout Europe pretty insanely, I'd say. It's hit Italy, France, Germany pretty hard recently, and it's creeping into Spain even.
Yes.
One of the interesting things I saw this week is South Korea has created Corona check drive-thrus. Have you seen these?
No, I didn't.
The South Korean government has set up these places where people can drive through, and people in hazmat suits will test them for coronavirus, and they've checked over 100,000 people.
Wow.
Just using this drive-through method. And I've seen some Americans upset sarcastically saying, we're the country of drive-through. And and also saying, could you imagine a drive-through where you could get healthier?
Yeah, that's not very common.
Yeah.
Here. So,
but that's your coronavirus update.
Well, what about the United States?
Community spread has begun in Seattle, at least, or in Washington State area, and maybe even California. So it's coming.
How concerned should I be about this, John?
Well, the lovely part about living in the state of Indiana is people don't usually leave the state of Indiana.
Be careful about offending our largest listener base.
I was talking to my dad this week, and he mentioned that they live in Tampa, and he mentioned that they have a couple of cases, and the whole town's going crazy.
Yeah.
And I said, we don't have any in Indiana yet. And his response was, people don't visit Indiana. That was his response.
Yeah. Okay. Typical elitist East Coaster, right?
Yeah. That's us. Typical elite East Coast.
That's what the Sloats traffic in.
Yep. That's who we are.
East Coast elitism. Exactly. So, in any case, I think there are some reasonable precautions to take, but I have to feel like this is a bit overhyped in terms of when you consider the actual numbers compared to, say, how many people die of the flu every year. I think there's reasonable precautions to take. I mean, it's always good advice to wash your hands. Sure, absolutely. But I think the media can play a role in overblowing the extent and the this is the global apocalypse right now. We've reached the end, and everyone's gonna, a third of the world's population is gonna die off in the coronavirus epidemic or a pandemic. Is that what we're calling it now? I don't know the terminology.
Yeah. So I actually did research on this.
Of course you did.
There's a big difference between the words epidemic and pandemic, and they're not levels necessarily.
Okay.
But they have to do with epidemic has to do with like the spread in an area, and pandemic has to do with how far-reaching it is.
I see.
Geographically speaking.
So you could tease that back to the Greek prepositions that are in front of the word demic there, right? The pan being all,
yes.
right? And then the epi meaning upon, concentrated outbreak there. See, you're not going to get that kind of analysis anywhere else. You are not going to find that kind of coronavirus analysis anywhere else. Speaking of something you're not going to find anywhere else, which is actually probably not true because there'll be a million.
Probably
of
not
these.
true at all. Yeah.
But we are doing our first true listener participation activity. Wouldn't you call it this? It's fair to say.
Yeah. Certainly not forced by any means.
No,
not a
absolutely.
forced participation activity. But we are going to have a March Madness bracket challenge pool thing.
Yeah.
So whether or not you love sports or whether or not you just don't care at all, log on, fill out a bracket, be a part of this, and whether you choose by your deep analysis of the teams or whether you choose by jersey color,
yes,
we want you to be a part of this. We want to see how well you do. And we're going to have a giveaway, and one of those things is going to be one of the giveaways, or the giveaway is going to be one of Doc's books.
Yeah. So for the winner, we will go ahead and send you a signed copy of one of my books, and we can even discuss which book that might be. If you say, well, maybe I already have Asking the Right Questions. Can I get a Philippians commentary? Can I get one of your dissertations? We might have to talk more about that. That's a pretty,
the dissertation's
a pricey
expensive,
ticket. But I got some of those laying around. The studies in the Pauline epistles. You've got some options here that we can probably discuss. But I do want to encourage people who may not be necessarily the most sports savvy. Often we find that people who are in that category can do even better than people who actually pay attention to college basketball on a regular basis.
Yeah, they tend to do pretty well particularly this year, because it's a crapshoot.
It's absolutely wide open. Yeah. Absolutely wide open.
So anybody could win this thing.
You want to give the information on how they can find this, because we'll tweet this out and we'll make this.
Yeah. So all this information will be in the show notes as well. But if you just go on Yahoo, go to their fantasy page and search for our bracket or our group, Various and Sundry Podcast, and then the password is just Grace Seminary, all one word, all lowercase letters. So that'll get you in. And then when the brackets come out, when did the brackets come out?
So Selection Sunday is, let's see, we're recording on a Tuesday. It was 2 weeks from this past Sunday. So that was, the 1st? So I guess that'd be the 15th, I believe, is Selection Sunday.
So you have some time, but log in, join, and we will begin. We will keep you up to date as when you need to fill out that bracket.
Absolutely.
And, tell it to your friends and family. We'd love to see them participate.
Yeah, it'd be great to get a large number of participants in this, and bragging rights and a free book are on the line. So why not, right?
Yeah, let's do it.
So, well, in addition to that, I'm not sure there's really that much else going on that we want to hit on in terms of the world of sports. Do you want to give us our spring training update for?
Well, I'm just going to give you the Mets spring training update.
Okay.
It's a slow time in sports. Spring training has begun, but the games don't really count, and you only see the stars for a couple of innings. The Mets haven't reported any injuries, which is lovely.
Okay.
And we're hearing the weirdest news stories come out of spring training, where the players get interviewed more regularly. They're a little bit more laid back. So it came out that the Mets last year, during their incredible run in the second half, some of the key players were getting together late at night and just eating cookies together and talking baseball.
Okay.
And so these 4 or 5 guys were getting together and just downing boxes of cookies and just talking about playing the game and doing these different things. And all the New York media is just going, oh my gosh, look how close they are. This is a team, and saying, like, look how well they're going to do.
And how does that play with your firm conviction that sugar is the devil? Because obviously that would be a high sugar intake there. Does it cause conflict in you to embrace this sort of team unity around?
Yeah, when it comes to sugar consumption, I'm a pluralist. So anybody and everyone can consume the amount of sugar that they want, however their convictions lead them. But so I apply that to the Mets as well.
Okay.
No injuries to speak of from Mets camp just yet, which is a good thing. There's some trade rumors going around right now, particularly with the Yankees, which is disturbing to me, that if we trade with the Yankees, I don't really want to that would really be making a deal with the devil.
Yeah, there you go.
I don't want to do that. But other than that, it's been a good spring training, which is no news, or dumb news is good news.
Sure. Now, I will say, even though I don't follow baseball very closely, I have heard a couple of things coming out of spring training that have it piqued my curiosity at least.
Okay, let me know what they are.
One of them is the high rate of Astros players getting plunked by pitchers.
Yeah.
And clearly that's going to continue, at least through the spring training. I'll be curious to see how that develops into the regular season and whether Major League Baseball steps in and says, look,
don't do it.
If you do it, you're tossed immediately. And the second story is related. Trevor Bauer. Have you heard this story? Trevor Bauer.
Yes, I saw this morning. This is fantastic.
Former Indians pitcher. I can't remember who he's pitching with now.
Was he with the Reds?
Could be. I don't remember. But his way to sort of throw shade at the Astros is he is, in the words of Chris Traeger, literally telling the batter at the plate what pitch he's going to throw.
Yeah.
He's telling the batter, I'm going to throw a fastball, and then throws it.
On the Astros piece, there is a Twitter account that is dedicated to just replaying images of them. I think it's like Astros Shame Tour.
Okay.
And it gives a daily account of how many times they were hit by a pitch.
That's great.
Which is fantastic.
That's great.
But yes, I saw Trevor Bauer does some sort of hand signal to let them know
like
this is a fastball coming.
That's great. That's a great way for a pitcher to throw shade at them.
I love it.
In a meaningless game, right? I mean, especially for an established pitcher like Trevor Bauer, he's not fighting for a roster spot. And so, he's getting some work in, getting the arm loose.
So if Trevor Bauer is going to throw at somebody, what hand sign is he going to give?
I would think typically, obviously a fastball is easier to steer, right?
Sure.
But, you throw a breaking ball at somebody, less chance of injury. You throw a breaking ball into somebody's back or rib cage, and it, by comparison, doesn't really hurt.
Yeah. I guess the good news for Jose Altuve is he's so small he's going to be difficult to hit this season.
Yeah, I hope he worked on his agility in the offseason because he's going to need to dodge some pitches. In any case, that's their occupation. And so as we transition to our topic for the day, we are going to follow up on our conversation from the previous episode on work. So we covered some aspects of the topic of work, how we're to think about it, the dangers of it becoming an idol, and also even thinking a little bit about some of the generational differences we have observed, I think is probably a fair way to put it. And so as we reflected on that subject, we thought maybe there was more we could talk about. So we've decided to go with a part 2 here.
Yeah.
Why not, right?
So do you want to give a quick breakdown of, my goodness, here's sort of the 1,000-foot view, maybe in a minute or two, of our conversation from last week as far as work. Like, how does that connect to the garden, those sorts of things? Yeah,
so you're testing my memory here, but...
Nothing like putting you on the spot,
right.
huh?
We did discuss the goodness of work, how work has its roots in the garden, related to God's original commission of humanity, both in Genesis 1 with sort of a more royal dimension to it of be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, rule over and subdue it, that there's an aspect of stewardship there, of expanding the scope of the garden in terms of ruling over it, caring for it. In essence, exercising God's own rule over creation itself in a sort of royal capacity. And then Genesis 2 brings along another angle where there's more of a priestly connotation there of human beings are priests who mediate God's presence and protect the purity of God's sanctuary. So if you think of Eden as God's sanctuary where he dwells with humanity, part of the work of Adam and Eve was to protect the purity of that sanctuary and to be conduits of God's presence and grace and mercy and power on earth throughout creation. And of course, that means that work is inherently good. Work is a good thing that God made. It's not a result of the fall. What's a result of the fall in Genesis 3 is the hardship connected with work, the frustration, the difficulties, the lack of resources necessary to accomplish that work. All the things that make work difficult are a result of the fall. And then we talked about how at the end, in the new heavens and the new earth, we will work. We will have work to do, but all the frustrations that make work difficult will be removed. And so we will find the appropriate level of satisfaction and contentment in that work without making it an idol.
And part of that was that the garden having boundaries, and we see new heavens, new earth as being much larger.
Sure.
We are meant to expand that, taking the raw materials of creation and using them in order to create essentially more garden, to create more Eden, to create more shalom, peace, whatever you want to call it, as we extend the garden.
Yeah, and in the new heavens and new earth, that process is, it seems at least, that there's no real expansion work at that point, because really the picture seems to be that all of the new creation is where God dwells with his people, and there's no hint of impurity or anything like that. So,
and that's lovely to talk about. Like that's very inspiring. Like I love a good, my goodness, let's look at the garden in Genesis, and let's look at the new heavens, new earth in Revelation. But how do we connect that to our everyday work? How do we connect that to the plumber or to the farmer, or to maybe the farmer's a little bit easier, but to regular everyday vocations and jobs?
Sure. I think that when that question comes to mind, there are a couple of texts that I go to besides, we've already talked about Genesis 1 and 2, and I'll start with this one. In 1 Corinthians 10:31, the idea of whatever you do, do it to the glory of God. Whether you eat or whether you drink, you do it to the glory of God. And in the context, that's specifically towards an issue that the church in Corinth is dealing with. But there's very much a sense in which whatever God calls us to do, we're to do it for his glory, to draw attention to his character, to his attributes, and to be an expression of that. And so that applies even to the everyday work that we have, no matter what our occupation is, that there's a sense in which God calls us to do it. And I would make an extension of this as the idea of excellence, to pursue excellence in what we do as a reflection of God's own character, so that whether it's working on a road construction crew, whether it's serving as a nurse in a hospital, whether it's being a receptionist at an office, whatever context God has placed you in work, the idea is that part of what he calls you to do is to do it to the best of your ability, and do so in a way that demonstrates an attribute of God pursuing excellence. So that's one element there. There's more, but I don't want to steal any thunder you might have. What about you? Any texts or kind of theological principles that help guide some more of the specifics of everyday work for you?
Yeah, no, the excellence piece is a big one for me personally as I work through my day-to-day. In fact, I recently heard of a discipline in a book called The Common Rule, where this individual wakes up every morning and prays that he will have basically the gusto to build God's kingdom. He then stops in the middle of his work in the middle of the day and gets on his knees and prays for God to allow him to view his work not as something that's building his brand or his own personal life, but is something that he does ultimately to God's glory. Right in the middle of the day, this individual is a lawyer, gets down on his knees,
Okay,
prays that, and then in the evening prays for, Lord, help me to have peace that I'm not able to do everything, but basically. And so that's sort of his ritual, and that's something that here and there I've adopted, but not totally. And then
can I follow up on that?
Yeah.
Since you're going to move on to another one, before I just want to. My follow up on that is that I think there's a contrasting. Actually, I'll jump off of the last thing you said there. Is that part of what I think helps keep excellence from turning into a sort of type A overdriven kind of personality, which the pursuit of excellence can easily lead to, is that recognition that God is the only one who gets everything done on his to-do list every day.
Right.
Nobody else does. And if you do, you probably don't have a very extensive to-do list.
Yeah.
Right? And so I think the pursuit of excellence can easily turn into a sense of performance-based mentality that can lead to frustration because you get to the end of the day and you're like, I didn't get everything done that I wanted to get done today. And then there's that sense of disappointment or frustration. And sometimes I think there's a legitimate piece of that. If you look back and go, well, yeah, I was just lazy. Like I didn't work as hard as I could have, or I was not as efficient as I could have. But oftentimes it's, you know what, I was overly ambitious in what I thought I could get done today. That was unrealistic to begin with. Or I set this out to do, but then someone interrupted it with a real personal need or a real situation that needed my attention, and that was more important than completing the task list on my app today. So I think there's some of those dynamics of that pursuit of excellence is good, but of course can be twisted into you become so performance driven that if you get to the end of the day and you didn't complete your task list, there's this sense of disappointment and frustration that leads to some sinful attitudes.
And that's really the ultimate expression of that is sleep, right? Where you and I at the end of the day go, I've done what I can, time to go to bed.
Yeah.
And you know, sleep is sort of the great leveler mechanism of rest, even we could say, that God has given us, right? That we as humans, and Keller makes this point really clear in his book, is that we as humans are supposed to not just work or not just pursue rest, but are supposed to do those things in rhythm.
Yeah.
Right? There's supposed to be this rhythm of work and rhythm of rest. And I think that's an important thing. I think we see that in the creation account, right? Where God does this work of creation and then ultimately rest. And I'll make this point again. I think I made it last week that seventh day doesn't end, right? There's no evening and morning on that day. And so that rest is I think meant to be eternal at some level. It's supposed to be a picture of what we will one day experience. But there's supposed to be this back and forth, and I hear a lot of teaching on rest, and it seems to be like, oh my goodness, we're already the assumption is you're so in love with work and doing so much that you absolutely just need to stop.
Right.
And I think there needs to be a balance there, that this is something that's done in rhythm.
Yeah, and I think I'm fascinated with the whole area of sleep. I've even done a little bit of reading on current research on sleep and that sort of stuff.
Really?
Far from being an expert, but it's an area of interest because it is quite fascinating when you think about the fact that God made us in a way that requires sleep, that he built us where we require sleep. And if you think about it, most experts suggest that we as human beings should get around, 7-8 hours of sleep a day. That's a third of your life. A third of your day is built around this unconsciousness where your body does all sorts of things. There's lots of different research about, what happens when you sleep, but all the things that your brain and your body does to, in one sense, kind of recharge the batteries that is needed. And then when you look at some of the studies even of sleep deprivation, that there are worse effects in some ways of extended sleep deprivation than of many sort of addictions to narcotics or other kinds of drugs. Like the effects can be that bad if it's a prolonged, intense deprivation of sleep.
So you would rather me do drugs than miss my 8 hours?
That's exactly the takeaway.
Okay, that's what I'm hearing.
Yeah. So I do think that as part of this mixture, and this is where I think the sleep piece comes in, is on the one hand we pursue excellence, and on the other hand, we have to learn to be okay with good enough. Mm-hmm. That there's lots of things you do in life that you think, if I put more time into that or had more resources, I could do it better. But that would mean I'd neglect these other responsibilities, these other tasks, these other contexts where I have responsibilities as well. And so some people can get paralyzed by this. If they sort of take the excellence thing to an extreme, they get paralyzed and can't get to, this is good enough. This is the best I can do with the time and the resources I have, and therefore I'm okay with that. I I can honestly say before the Lord, this was the best I could do with what I had.
Yeah, the time that's been given to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's difficult for some. I knew of a professor at one of my former schools. I won't name the school or the professor, but
tantalizing.
He was such a perfectionist that he almost never published, and that led him eventually to leave being a professor, because he'd work on these projects, these book projects, and he'd have them essentially done, but he'd continue to pick at them, just like, oh, I need to tweak that, that paragraph. I need to tweak that chapter. Right? I need to and publishers would understandably be like, we need a manuscript from you, and he would be so paralyzed by that like perfectionism that he'd never turn the manuscript in. And that's not unique necessarily to this academic context. That could be in other contexts where if you're working on a presentation or something where you can get so consumed with perfectionism that you don't actually finish the job because in some ways, I think that becomes an identity issue. Your identity becomes so tied to, I got to get this perfect. I got to get this just right. So
yeah. Could we talk about the other side of the coin a little bit, and maybe this, as a published author, I imagine that you don't struggle with this one quite as much, but I'm curious to hear your reflections on it. What about the person that just constantly struggles with, that's good enough, and just sort of turns in things haphazardly, and or is constantly doing projects that are half done or 3/4 done, but then they're just like, shrug their shoulders, good enough. I got other things going on that I want to do, or I want to, whatever it may be, video games, whatever it might be. How do we combat that in our lives?
Yeah, I think that that can be tricky, but because so much of that's contextually driven in terms of whether good enough is good enough, right? And so I also think that that's where some of the piece of the excellence comes back in, of wanting to present our work. If you think of even like Romans 12:1 and 2 of offering our lives as a sacrifice to God.
Yeah.
That you think of the idea that everything you do at one level is an offering to God as a sort of sacrifice, as an act of worship. Then I would hope that would bring in some measure of incentivizing of, I should do this well. I mean, I think we've all had those experiences, right, where maybe you've got a project or something you're working on, and maybe it's just for yourself, and you're like, I think that's good enough. And at the end of the day, you're like, well, if I'd have spent more time, maybe I should have, but it's no big deal. But if you're doing that same thing for someone like an authority figure or maybe a loved one or something, where it's like, oh, suddenly you maybe kick it up a notch of, maybe this, like a project around the house, right? Maybe if it's your own house, you're like, that's good enough.
Yeah.
But if you're doing it for a friend or for a family member, you might take that extra step of like, well, if this was my own house, maybe I wouldn't do all those little minor finishing touches. Maybe I'd just let that little spot go or something. But if it's someone that you really care to impress or that is super important to you, you might go the extra step and be like, no, I really need to spend the extra time necessary to finish off those rough edges and make it excellent.
Yeah. Part of this conversation as we think about work is efficiency, productivity. Those areas tend to be big things, particularly when we talk about office work like you and I do. What are some ways that you go about efficiency or productivity that might or may not be helpful to some of our listeners?
Sure. I think that when it comes to these areas, of course, there can be the danger of idolatry, to be sure. That going back to that sort of performance-driven mentality, that you get too much of your significance or meaning or identity from, I'm a guy that gets things done.
Yeah.
Or, I struggle with this because I can tend to be pretty performance oriented to the point where, and this is sort of confession time here, I'm sure there are other people who do this. I don't think you do this necessarily. Maybe you do. I don't know. But I'm the kind of person who occasionally, not all the time, but occasionally, will put things on my to-do list that I've already done just so I can check them off.
I have done that before in busy seasons.
Yeah.
Just to get some momentum going on getting the to-do list. Yeah, absolutely.
And so, I'm sure there are some listeners who are like, that's really demented. But
you got a problem.
Yeah, well, maybe, probably. But I do think that there can be a value in thinking about productivity and efficiency, because if you embrace some of the things that make you more productive and help you to get things done more efficiently, oftentimes it expands the scope of what you can do. Mm-hmm. And if you understand it in those terms, if I'm more efficient, if I find ways to get things done, especially things that are necessary but not the most exciting or the most broadly helpful to people. If I find ways to get some of the smaller tasks in life done, the necessary things, maybe it's responding to emails, or maybe it's just doing paperwork or some of the administrative pieces of life. If there are more efficient ways to do that, that frees up more time for me to either invest it in other tasks that are in some ways more significant, or it might free up more time for me to interact with and build relationships with other people that I wouldn't otherwise have. So I do think there's a biblical case to be made for efficiency and productivity, and looking at some of those sort of tools of the trade. I mean, there's the Stephen Covey, the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. There's some other very prominent kind.
Have you gone through that? Have you gone through
I haven't.
I haven't either.
No. For a lot of those things, I will occasionally skim some of those materials. We're like, what? Well, let's see quickly anything I can glean from this.
Look at the chapter titles, figure out what them are, and kind of fill your own meaning in. Yeah,
sure. But I do think that probably the biggest productivity tip that I have that's been helpful to me is on Sundays at some point, whether it's in the afternoon or the evening, I try to take about anywhere between 15 to 20 minutes and look at my calendar for that week and look at the task list that I've got as to what is on the horizon and what needs to get done, so that I have a plan of attack, so that I'm not coming in Monday morning and then trying to figure out, okay, how do I best spend my time today? When do I do these tasks? When do I do this? How do I manage it? If I have a good sense on Sunday of what the week looks like, I tend to be more effective and more productive in that context. What about you?
Probably the biggest thing I do right now is I have great control of my schedule for the most part. So I really try to schedule things that require my energy and attention and my creative forces, and I try to schedule those during those times where I try to schedule my biggest projects during those times. Emails.
And are you a morning person or an afternoon or an evening person when it comes to those kind of things?
I'm a morning person for those things. So the earlier I can get up, the better usually, and I'm able to tackle writing or projects more easily during the morning. And then afternoon is usually like, my goodness, I'm just sucking coffee and trying to get emails done and those sorts of getting more just mindless tasks done. And usually I'll throw on sports radio during that time or something like that as something to keep my brain engaged in something while I'm doing meaningless tasks.
Maybe mindless tasks. You don't mean meaningless tasks.
Sorry. Yes, mindless tasks.
There you go. Okay.
Yes. Emails are important.
Yes. As we encourage people to email the show.
Yeah.
Yeah. Give John something to do while he's listening to sports radio in the afternoons.
That'd be great. Yeah.
So, well, we made a couple of recommendations in terms of books last week, more on the sort of broader topic of work. We mentioned a book by Jim Hamilton and a book by Tim Keller.
And those are really big picture. Yeah. Keller's gets into even different fields and how he connects that work to God's work, which is really helpful. I've read one of the 2 books on our list here. I've not read the second one, so could I talk about the first one real quick?
Go for it, yeah.
Matt Perman, who used to oversee the Desiring God website.
John Piper's ministry.
Yes. Put out a book, goodness, probably 5 or 6 years ago now?
Yeah, at least.
Called What's Best Next, and it was about his system for productivity. Mm-hmm. And he was, as you read the book, you're kind of like, oh my goodness, this guy's just incredibly productive.
Right.
And so that was a very helpful piece. Is like, okay, here's how he's productive. Oh, I can incorporate that. I really can't incorporate this. And you go chapter by chapter. Very, very helpful.
And I will add, what distinguishes that book from a lot of other productivity books is maybe the first third of it is very much a sort of theological foundation for thinking about productivity.
Yeah.
So it's not just, here's 5 tips.
Here's
go
tips
do them.
and tricks. Yeah.
It's very much rooted. It sets a good sort of biblical and theological foundation so that it's trying to avoid some of the errors we've talked about in terms of being so performance-driven, you find too much meaning and significance in that, or the other end being lazy. It's a good sort of theological foundation from which those very practical suggestions flow out of. The second book is a book by Cal Newport called Deep Work. Have you heard of this book?
I have not read it.
Okay. I've read it, and basically he simply makes the case for we think we're multitasking and being more productive, but oftentimes we're not.
Yeah.
That really multitasking is not multitasking. It's just rapidly switching between more than one task. And that can be fine for certain contexts, to be sure, but the downside of it is that it inhibits our ability to do deep, sustained thinking and work. And so as a result, the level of our work, if we're not focused on trying to remove distractions and really focus on one task at a time, is that both the quality and the depth of our work regularly suffers. Now, when it comes to certain tasks, you probably don't need to go the deep work route, right? You don't need to necessarily remove all distractions to answer a lot of emails, right? Email tends to be a task that you can often do while other things are going on. But if you're in the kind of work where you need to produce something that is more thoughtful and more focused, he really makes a big point of you can get a lot more done in focused. If you have blocks of an hour or two where you completely remove all distractions, and that means like no checking email during that time, phone not in the room with you, like completely locked into whatever you're doing, whether it's reading, whether it's writing, whether it's working on a project or something, that the payoff in terms of productivity is significant, that you can get way more done and at a better quality in an hour that way than you can often get done in 2 or 3 with the sort of multitask, work on this for 15 minutes. Oh, I checked my email, now I'm checking Twitter.
Yeah.
Next thing you know, you blew 20 minutes before you're back to the task and you've lost your train of thought. So that's a helpful book.
Okay. I know I have a friend that just started his THM program at another institution, and this Deep Work is one of the books they had to read for that.
That's good. Well, we're on to our athlete as we move towards the end here, and I think we have a decent collection of options here. The number 9 has served well.
Yeah. Gordie Howe, of course, the hockey player.
Yeah, and Bobby Hull.
Hull.
Giving a nod to hockey, not that either of us really follows it very closely.
Yeah, I followed it when I was in college and high school more, but less so recently. Living outside the Pittsburgh area has caused me to not follow it quite as much.
Okay.
In the baseball realm, Joe DiMaggio, Reggie Jackson, Roger Maris, Ted Williams, all come to mind on our list of athletes to talk about.
Yeah, and then when we go to the NFL, Drew Brees,
yeah.
Which it can seem in some ways interesting to talk about where he fits in the all-time scheme of things when it comes to NFL quarterbacks.
Yeah, he's a fascinating case, isn't he?
Because he's put up these absurd numbers, but he's also done it in an era where that's been more prominent. He's got 1 Super Bowl win, and and it seems like, as far as I can tell, an outstanding dude. Like, seems to be very active in his community and has avoided scandal as far as I can.
I listened to an interview with him, and he was on the phone, and he's on his front porch, and he's talking about being on his front porch on this interview, and in the middle of being on his front porch, a runner comes in front of him and just shouts, "Go Saints," or something like that, and he shouts "Go Saints" back to this run, and so it just kind of gave the the feeling that he was just part of the community down in New Orleans.
And he's a semi-local guy in terms of he went to college at Purdue, which is not too far away from our world headquarters here on the various Sundry podcast.
Wow, world headquarters.
And when it comes to Ohio State athletes, David Boston, you recognize that name, was a wide receiver for Ohio State.
Like first-team gym guy, right? I mean, he was just
he was jacked.
He was huge, yeah.
He was. But we haven't named the athlete that I think we're going to go with here, right?
Yeah, I'm excited about this one.
Well, it's your show.
Yeah, I think we're going to name the episode, and by I think we definitely are. Mia Hamm.
Yes.
So was a part of the first professional women's sports league, won a World Cup, was a part of several Olympics, was a soccer icon in our country for a period, and of course, what she's maybe most famous for, marrying Noma Garcia Para.
No. Oh gosh, yeah. Well, I might push back on that as being most well known for that.
You're right. Probably soccer icon is probably top.
Yeah, she was definitely responsible for a major part of the surge in interest in women's soccer here in the United States and even worldwide, I think you can say.
And I would say, to a certain extent, like the soccer movement in America was really done by the women's national team in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
I can think of, we even talked about it before, 2-3 players from that 99 World Cup team. Mm-hmm. Can you name any male soccer players from the 90s?
No, but American men's soccer has not been strong.
Has not been great. I mean, they've had moments, they've had flashes, but women's soccer, and it really began right here with Mia Hamm. And so this is the Mia Hamm episode.
Okay. All right. So there it is, and hence my reference earlier in the show to my go-to guy for women's soccer. So, all right. One thing you liked this week.
Yeah, I've really been enjoying a British podcast called Asknt Wright Anything, and that's hosted by Justin Briley, who's a phenomenal interviewer. And I think really good interviewers have don't just get the information necessary out of somebody, but get down into the personal weeds of a person. And this happens on this podcast where you get to see a little bit behind the curtain of what N.T. Wright is like, as well as the depth of his knowledge and wisdom. And so you listen to him talk about how much he loves to golf, or sometimes he whips out the guitar and plays it on the
that's great
on the air. So you get to see a little bit of N.T. Wright, which I thought was great.
Yeah, that's good. One of my favorite memories from being a PhD student was having breakfast with N.T. Wright and Doug Moo.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that was fascinating.
Really? How tall is N.T.? Because Doug Moo is very tall.
Very tall, yes.
How tall is N.T. Wright? He's a big guy.
He's thick, but Tom Wright is not an especially tall man. I think he's probably 5'10" to 6 foot is my guess.
Okay. There's a loud noise going on that we need to tell her. There's a loud rumbling. I hope it doesn't make the audio recording.
That sounds like some sort of maintenance. It is spring break around here.
It is spring break on campus, and so... Oh my goodness, that sounds like somebody's drilling for oil outside or something.
Well, let's hope they find it.
Anyway, what was the one thing you liked this week?
So I'm going to go with a podcast as well. It's called Bomber.
Bomber? I haven't heard of this.
So I want to say it's 8 or 9 episodes, so it's not a long one, but it's the story of a serial bomber in Austin, Texas from 2018 who set off a series of package bombs and really terrorized the city of Austin and the surrounding area for a few weeks.
Wow. So, I don't remember this.
I really don't remember
2018?
2018, yeah. March 2018 is when this was happening. So about almost exactly 2 years ago to this time period. And so, yeah, the podcast is called Bomber. And I think I'm about episode 6 so far. I think there's 8 or 9 total. Thankfully, they caught him relatively quickly, right? I mean, it wasn't a Unabomber situation where you've got him, sending bombs for years. I think it resolved itself within a few weeks. But I think he ended up setting off 6 or 7 bombs in the larger Austin area.
I need to get to Austin. They're supposed to have one of the greatest coffee scenes in the country down in Austin.
Indeed. So maybe a go and counter trip.
Yeah, doing a coffee tour throughout America. I love that idea.
Yeah, that could be a little pricey. Well, I think we probably need to land the plane because in addition to them drilling for oil.
I know, there's drums downstairs now.
So, indeed, we are in a studio that is right above the worship arts area. So, in any case, I think we have managed to accomplish our stated goal of wandering about our various and sundry topics. And so, until next time, the Lord bless y'all real good.
Later.